You said in your speech that you witnessed cover-ups of the rape gangs. Now, I thought that was fascinating. Can you talk about what you saw? What happened? Did you report these people? Should they, be prosecuted for covering up these terrible crimes? Can you expand on what you said?
So obviously all over Whitehall there was mass cover-ups of the whole thing for the same reason that we've already alluded to, fear. Fear of the political consequences of facing reality. What I saw in 2011, there are lots of different things. Well, normally in Whitehall, the cliche that it's a cock-up, not a conspiracy, is generally true. The one big exception, I would say, is regarding child abuse, where there are actually multiple conspiracies constantly and largely successful. So we agreed in January 2020, Aussie point system, low-skilled, unskilled cut. Then, of course, COVID happens. So the whole thing became a moot issue in 2020 because it was literally illegal to move, immigration completely craters everywhere. I then, of course, have a big fallout with Boris in November 2020, with him, his girlfriend, etc., leave. In 2021, Boris then says, he has all these people coming to him saying, the disruption of COVID means we've got to get all these people in. Supply chains problems is global, da, 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 da. Now, there was some truth in that, obviously, right? Everything had been massively disturbed by COVID. There was an issue from California to Spain. But essentially what they did was they completely opened the floodgates and they started processes like cheating the high-skilled issue. So when we said high-skilled, we meant people with PhDs in astrophysics, people who can actually come and be professor of whatever or be some hotshot doctor in the NHS. What they then did was they redefined high-skilled immigration as low-skilled people to come in and do social care. Because the Treasury said, we need all of these people to come in cheap, and because the Treasury's view of the world is the Ponzi scheme on immigration is central to the Treasury economic model. You bring in a whole load of unskilled people, and then your models say, they'll pay taxes because they're young, blah, 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 blah. And then when they're old, then you bring in another wave of people, and the Ponzi scheme keeps going. Inside the Treasury, this is regarded as sensible. Most of the country regards it as completely insane. But that's the basic process that happened. You have Treasury pushing very hard, and the Treasury is all-powerful once the vote leave forces had left.
So we had some of these policies come in, which has resulted in the Boris wave. You mentioned a few: the social care visa, the post-study so-called Deliveroo visa, the expansion of the skilled visa route, which include, for example, chefs can come in. And what happens is you get people cousins of people in Pakistan who come and sort of hire them and work as kebab shop people on a supposedly high-skilled visa. You've got these salary threshold cuts, removing the RLMT. This is for foreign-trained doctors. There's a kind of equivalency, and they introduced the equivalency so foreign-trained doctors can work in the NHS and so on.
Even worse than that, in lots of ways, is the Treasury also actively vandalizes training doctors and nurses, British people becoming doctors and nurses. It consistently keeps cutting the budgets to do that, and it says, just import them all instead. So it's not just the importation, it's also the deliberate choice not to spend money training our own people.
So my question is twofold. One, who was against this? Who was actively saying this is madness? The voters said, we want less immigration. They've said it for the last 20 years in every single election, including Brexit, and we're going to do the exact opposite. So who was against it? And was this an ideological thing? Was this like Blair saying, or one of the Blair members of the cabinet saying, we're going to rub the right's noses in diversity. This is about, making Britain more diverse. This is a kind of liberal. Boris has been a liberal in immigration for a long time. So who was against it, and was it ideological?
Obviously, I wasn't there in the meetings in 2021 when this was decided, so I can't say from first-hand. I can say first-hand things that I know from 2020, but not first-hand in 21. As far as I know, really very few people argued against it. And as you could see from the reaction when they did it in 2021, when me and others said, what on earth are you doing? The Tory party, almost en masse, went along with it, the same as they went along en masse with breaking the guarantee that we would not put up income taxes on normal people. Tory MPs went along with all of that as well. So I think very few people actually pushed back against it. On your second point, I don't think it wasn't organized from Boris, partly because very little is organized from Boris in principle, But it's just not how the whole thing worked. It was a mix of his psychology wanting to be friends with the establishment and powerful bureaucratic forces inside the system. And again, I would go back to this example of the winter fuel thing, right? Many officials, like, the top officials based at the Treasury are cleverer than roughly 100% of the MPs. And they're there for a long time, so they have actual priorities that they care about. If the MPs don't have priorities, therefore, the priorities of the Treasury end up dominating. That's why the mad thing happened on winter fuel payments, which no one can quite understand, including the Labour MPs. Like, well, why are we having to go out and defend this? It's the same thing that happened here. The Treasury has priorities. In the absence of counter-priorities as a political force in number 10 Downing Street, the system just does what Whitehall wants.
So your lecture focused on what should be done, and immigration, I think, is one of the major crises facing Britain today, particularly when it comes to public trust in politicians and institutions.
Yeah.
In America, Donald Trump is enacting his campaign of mass deportations, and if you look at opinion polls, that's a very popular policy that he's doing. In Sweden, they've introduced, or they're going to introduce, a new policy next year where they're offering migrants who are low-skilled or unemployed $34,000 to leave Sweden, to encourage them to actually leave.
Yeah.
When it comes to the solution to immigration, do you think that a serious government should look at some of what's happening in Sweden, in the United States, and a kind of adjacent question, why is Nigel Farage, Richard Tyson, others not supporting mass deportations? When I ask them this question, they always say, no, we don't like mass deportations, despite it being so popular in America.
So I think if you want to restore public trust, then you have to take a serious country has borders. If you don't have borders, you're not a country. And you have to have clear distinctions between lawful and illegal immigration. And if you allow that distinction to be destroyed the way that Whitehall has done, then you have the current shambles. Now, I argued before the Brexit referendum, immigration is now the dominant issue in British politics. If we win the referendum and take back control of immigration policy to here, you will immediately see immigration will drop as an issue in terms of priority, and people's attitudes towards immigrants will improve. The FT, The Economist, all of the usual people laughed at this and said completely mad, but everyone now can look at the data, and it is 100% unarguable that what I said before 2016 was true. Graph goes straight down like that for concern in immigration. Now, fundamental thing that's happened is the combination of the small boats issue has happened, making the whole thing extremely visible, and the use by the courts of the European Convention on Human Rights to make it effectively impossible for the government to stop this problem. I went into this in extreme detail in 2020. I got the Navy, I got Special Forces, I got the lawyers, I got everyone in to number 10 to go through it all, and the answer is extremely simple. Operationally, it's one of the simplest problems facing the country to deal with boats. You can stop the boats in literally a few days. The entire problem is the legal structure which the MPs have imposed via the Human Rights Act and the way in which judicial review has evolved. The only solution to this is to repeal the Human Rights Act and to change how the judicial review system operates, along with a few other bits of international law. Now, this sounds like everyone in London, in Westminster treats this as if it's some crazy thing. All I'm suggesting is we go back to how things used to work before 1997. Right? So it's not some extraordinary revolutionary thing. On the broader question, yes, I think that if you are here unlawfully, you should leave. And I think that until and unless we restore this distinction, immigration will continue to poison politics.
And just very briefly, on the reform point, would you recommend to them, look, supporting mass deportations publicly, would that be a popular thing to the public? Yes or no?
I think it would be popular for the relevant sections of the electorate. There's obviously going to be a set of people, so there's roughly 20% of the people who say, join the euro, let the UN control the British Army, give everything control to some international body, rejoin the EU immediately, right? That's 20% of the population. They are obviously not going to support this. But in terms of the relevant elements of the population, yes. But I think a problem that Farage has in general is a problem that you can see across the West at the moment as the old system fails. a lot of people like Farage is, in a sense, the same as a lot of the other parties, right? They formed their views in the 90s and 2000s. And it's very hard for them to adjust to a world where the truths and conventional ideas of that time are broken down. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see reform now getting caught in lots of these things, because it's hard for them to adapt. Because it's hard for all of these old things to adapt.
And it looks like Trump is ahead of the game on that. He's kind of more contemporary. He's not stuck in the past, on the issue of immigration, at least. Slightly flippant question, but I asked Liz Truss who her favourite Tory PM was other than Churchill and Thatcher. She said Javier Milei. I wanted to ask, I know you're interested in history. You're obsessed with Bismarck in a good way. How does the intelligence of contemporary politicians, people like Liz Truss, people like Boris, people in the cabinet, compare with our historical prime ministers or leaders of the past?
So obviously this is a theme that I've harped on about for over 10, 15 years, right? Like a fundamental aspect of what's happened, and I think something which business people have greatly underrated until recently is this big historic shift in talent. In the past, for obvious reasons, a lot of elite talent went into public service of some kind, government, armies, intelligence services. The reason is if you don't have elite talent in those things, you very quickly get your arms hacked off. So there were huge incentives for that to happen. Aristocratic societies did it naturally. But what's happened in the last 50 years is more and more elite talent has gone into some combination of maths, money, and computing. And that's fundamentally changed the caliber of the people, not just in the political parties, but also in the upper echelons of the civil service. If you go back and read the kind of documents that were written even 40 years ago, never mind 140 years ago, the caliber of the writing and the thought was extraordinarily different than the caliber of what is written and said now by the permanent secretary of whatever. Look at the cabinet secretary himself. Look at Wormold and go back and compare him with Bridges, with Maurice Hankey. Look at the caliber of a lot of the senior generals and go back and compare with Alan Brooke, Churchill's main general in World War II. So this is a general and fundamental issue across the Western world that partly because of this mix of nuclear weapons bringing long-term peace and the fall of the Soviet Union, society has evolved in a way where elite talent has moved off to these other things. And unless that changes, then we're going to stay in this dysfunctional situation.
Coming back to Farage, the people that he surrounded himself with, Zia Youssef, Richard Tice, the new chairman, Dr. David Ball, are you impressed with the decisions that he's made in terms of the human capital around him within reform? You know, David Ball, who today was saying that he believes in ghosts, and yesterday was saying immigration was the lifeblood of our country.
I'm afraid I don't really know very much about any of the characters you mentioned, but obviously, this is not to insult them, but it is obvious that reform has not embarked on the kind of major outreach of talent which I think is needed. What's actually needed in this country is a political project that very aggressively and openly says, we are replacing the elites. There are thousands of people in Whitehall who currently have jobs that shouldn't exist. The jobs are going to cease to exist. The people are going to be removed. We're going to change how the institutions work, and we are going to recruit much higher caliber elites. And that has to be at the heart of a serious political project. It's crazy to think that you can change the institutions if you have the same caliber of people and the same kind of HR system that rewards everyone for delaying everything, rewards everyone for not taking personal responsibility, that rewards all the most pathological and dysfunctional ways of operating. And you see it very, very clearly right in the civil service now, this nightmare thing where there's still a lot of incredibly able people join in their early 20s. But by the time they're 40, you have an inverse talent ratchet. The great people have almost all gone because they look at their boss and they say, I don't want to become like them. My God, it's a nightmare. And able people have choices, so able people go off and do other things. And then the absolute worst people loved by the HR system, and the people who then get promoted to be perm sec. So all of these things are connected. You can't change the system unless you change the people, and you can't get in great people unless you have a political project that says we actually must revive healthy, functioning institutions.
So let's say that your government gets in, or a government that you think is taking matters seriously. What should they try and declassify? Now, you've talked about the government, or sort of internal deep state, I'm going to use that crude phrase. They're overclassifying documents to do with paying off terrorists who are hiding in caves and so on. And in the United States, Trump is declassifying all sorts of documents. Yeah. Well, he said that he would around the JFK files, the Epstein files, but not just that, about basically what the DOJ and other organizations within the US government had been doing under Biden and other people. So you're advising the new government. Where should we look at declassifying information? Is too much information classified?
Yeah, you have a system where too much is classified, and then they can't actually keep a lot of secrets that they should keep secret. So as often, you have the worst of both worlds. So one big set of things is, as I alluded to, the whole issue about the ECHR and the Human Rights Act. So I'll give you a concrete example that became news last year. Generic raised the question, but then the whole thing went completely doolally in the media about the issue of special forces and whacking people abroad. Now, I've sat in these meetings, and I will tell you what actually happens. What actually happens is that terrorist X is identified in somewhere like Syria. The obvious thing to do from an intelligence perspective is for special forces to grab terrorist X, grab their phone, interrogate them, and then build a network out. Right? This is just classic counterinsurgency and how you deal with terrorism. What happened is that Cabinet Office officials said that arresting them and incarcerating them in the way that was proposed is unlawful under the Human Rights Act. However, they said, if a minister is prepared to sign the following document about the threat that they pose, it is lawful to whack them with a drone from above. So repeatedly over the last few years, you have this completely insane system driven by human rights law, whereby, now this all went crazy right with the media, because the media's claimed that, oh, Generic is saying that the SAS and whatnot are assassinating people unlawfully. It was the opposite of what the media said was the opposite of the truth. The whole point is not that these people are being whacked unlawfully. The whole point is the system is saying it's lawful to whack them, but not lawful to arrest them. Now, there are many, many, many things like this that happen all through the system, particularly around ECHR and the Human Rights Act, that are completely bonkers. I mentioned to you cases that I'd seen with guys literally being hunted from cave to cave, calling up the satellite phones, talking to their lawyers at the bar, trying to shake down the taxpayer for millions of quid, and getting it. So there's cases like that all around. That's a whole category of things, and I suggested this to Sunak. When I met with Sunak just after he became PM, I said to him, just declassify hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these cases in the documents, shove it all out into the public domain, and then just say the country has to look at these things and make a decision. If at the end of this, the majority of people say, actually, we still want to be part of the ECHR, fine, okay. But do it knowing how the system truly works, not because the truth of it is hidden from the voters.
I'm going to quote from your recent blog post. They've started propaganda operations with the old media to spread the meme that our real danger is the far right, code for white people. Now, one of the most insane stories I read, I think this week or last week, was that Prevent now classifies what's called cultural nationalism as a terrorist ideology. I'll define what cultural nationalism is to Prevent. Western culture is under threat from mass migration and a lack of integration by certain ethnic and cultural groups. Now, one suspects that many people in this room are all terrorists. How seriously should we be taking this stuff, or does this lead to the arrest of Lucy Connolly and others?
I think it's obviously crazy, right? I mean, you can agree with that statement that you've read out, or you can disagree. But the idea that it ought to be illegal to say that or argue for it, the idea that it's somehow like a precursor to being a terrorist, is obviously stupid. But the fact that such ideas are percolating in Whitehall shows what a crisis Whitehall is in. And the reason is because They are terrified of violence popping out. They thought and said last year when the riots started, the whole thing is like that far from being outside of our control. I've watched meetings with the police in Downing Street where they said to the Prime Minister, we can't go and do blah, we can't go and arrest blah because there'll be a riot and we can't actually do it. So the police are increasingly of the feeling that they can't take what most people regard as sensible action because they're fearful of what it will provoke. And that, I think, is just a disastrous slippery slope that they've got themselves onto. And you can see that slippery slope in operation, right, with the case a week or so ago, whenever it was, when the Turkish guy is done for blasphemy. Now, you can say that you're pro. Again, my point is not whether you should be for burning the Quran. You can say you're pro or anti blasphemy laws. That's something that should be debated in Parliament by the people that we elect, and then they decide and they vote on it, and that's that. What shouldn't happen is that elements of the system say, we're that far away from riots, so we've got to start using the courts to send signals that people can't do certain things because of fear of offending certain religions. Whatever religion, it doesn't matter if it's the Quran or anything. It's the principle at stake, which is just, it seems to me, is obviously disastrous and obviously very corrosive. And obviously you need a regime that says all of this sort of stuff is getting binned straight away. If you look at how bad it is, right, look around Parliament now. The marches have got closer and closer. The marches calling for a second Holocaust have got closer and closer and closer to Parliament. They are actively intimidating the MPs, and I talk to MPs. MPs are fearful. And you also have such a pathologically dysfunctional regime that it can't actually provide security for MPs that speak out and won't provide security for MPs that speak out. Now, again, there are endless laws on the statute books that could be used to actually solve these problems sensibly, but the pathological system will not use them, and therefore they pile tinder higher and higher and higher, waiting for a spark.
What does it say? I know you're interested in the security services, and I think that's an area which is under-scrutinized in the British media and beyond. But what we can see from the outside is I look on the head of MI6's Twitter account, and he has his pronouns in his bio, and he's obsessed with LGBTQ issues, tweeting about it and so on. I mean, what do you make of that? Do you think that he is a serious person? Why is he doing this?
I mean, most people are intensely mimetic, right? And most people copy what's around them because they're fearful about social approval. And what happened with the LGBTQ thing, plus Hamas thing, is that it became intensely mimetic, and therefore everyone started copying it. And no set of people are more susceptible to mimesis like that than graduates, intelligent graduates, who are the easiest to fool and the easiest to whip up into emotional frenzies. That madness spread all the way through Whitehall. In 2020, I said to Boris, we should just knock all this on the head. We should send people around, and we should just tear the entire infrastructure out of the Cabinet Office and out of Whitehall. Fire all of the people. Stonewall should be banned, kicked out. All of this bullshit should end immediately.
This is the head of MI6.
Yes.
This isn't graduates.
Yes. Correct?
What do we do with him?
I've just said, all of it needs rooting out. All of the madness needs rooting out. If people want to have those views, fine. But you're not having those views and staying in the intelligence services. Leave. You can't have... You can't have these deranged things spreading. I mean, Greta, right, is a perfect symbol for it, bringing together the kind of like anti-capitalist green cult with the pro-Hamas cult and the LGBTQ plus Hamas cult, all unified, wearing the Hamas outfit draped in the pride flag. It's the kind of perfect symbol for the madness which has infiltrated universities and infiltrated Whitehall, and it all needs rooting out.
Okay, 2 more questions and we're done. You said in your speech that you witnessed cover-ups of the rape gangs. Now, I thought that was fascinating. Can you talk about what you saw, what happened? Did you report these people? Should they, be prosecuted for covering up these terrible crimes? Can you expand on what you said?
So obviously all over Whitehall there was mass cover-ups of the whole thing for the same reason that we've already alluded to, fear. fear of the political consequences of facing reality. What I saw in 2011, I mean, there are lots of different things. Well, normally in Whitehall, the cliche that it's a cock-up, not a conspiracy, is generally true. The one big exception, I would say, is regarding child abuse, where there are actually multiple conspiracies constantly and largely successful. I watched these happening repeatedly in the Department of Education because the issue was parked there by Gordon Brown and Ed Balls, so I had to deal with it when I was there. I would watch the redacted documents and the actual unredacted documents about lots of these cases, and you could see that the redacted documents are redacted entirely to hide the incompetence of the system. Now, what happened on the gangs is that when Andrew Norfolk at the time started to try to report the issue, the council went to officials inside the Department of Education and said, we want to bring a judicial review to have the courts suppress the Times' reporting and not allow it to happen. Some of the officials inside the DFE, who routinely organized cover-ups on such issues, were of course very in favor of it. But there were another set of officials inside DFE who agreed with me that this was absolutely appalling, and in fact we should do the opposite. So what we ended up doing was saying to Michael Gove, you should write to the council and say that if you bring this judicial review, we will actually appear in court on behalf of the Times, not on behalf of you. That obviously blew up the judicial review attempt by the council to keep it secret, and then Norfolk could publish his piece in the Times. Unfortunately, I think Norfolk died recently without even knowing that this ever even happened. But that's just one small example of something which happened many, many times on this subject over a few decades in Whitehall, which is, of course, why the system is absolutely desperate not to have an inquiry. A system which has inquiries at the drop of a hat about all kinds of, like, one person dies, public inquiry, spend 80 million quid on lawyers, take 5 years. This case involving thousands and thousands and thousands of children, no.
It just, to me, it seems bizarre there's no accountability to the people that you're talking about. I mean,
it's only bizarre if you believe the old ideas about how the system works. It's not bizarre once you realize that the people there are not operating on the incentives or with the values that you think they are. It's actually completely standard and completely normal and completely unsurprising.
Okay, I'm going to quote from your latest blog, and you quoted Nietzsche. The democratization of Europe is at the same time an involuntary arrangement for the breeding of tyrants. 1 in 5 Generation Z and millennial Britons prefer strong leaders without elections to democracy, a recent poll revealed. Do you agree that democracy is overrated?
That's a very difficult question to answer.
Please be honest.
I would say no, it's not overrated, but I would say that if you go back and read the ancient analyses of democracy in Plato and in Thucydides in particular, particularly in Thucydides' book 3, where he talks about civil conflict and civil war, you see that the ancients assumed that, the ancients thought that you had to have the most educated people in charge of government. And therefore, kind of by definition, democracy was not the best system, which is why in the ancient world, most people thought that the best political regime was some kind of mixed system, where yes, the people have a vote on things, but it's not a pure democratic system like Athens. That, I think, of course, it's a crude generalization, but I think it's a reasonable way to summarize the kind of average educated perspective in ancient Athens or ancient Rome. So the issues that you can read about there are very live issues for us now. How does democracy obviously is in crisis, democratic regimes are in crisis. Personally, though, I hope that we find a way of reviving the regime rather than it be replaced by some new oligarchy. And I would also say that if you look around Britain now, the real problems that we've got politically are not problems with normal voters. Normal voters are generally good people with good instincts and are much more sensible. People often ask, or overcomplicate why we won the 2016, 2019 elections. Fundamental reason from my own perspective was that I like normal voters and I respect their views and I take them seriously. That is not the common view in Westminster. In Westminster, normal voters are basically held in contempt. And unsurprisingly, therefore, the contempt is now reflected back at Westminster. It's very confusing for the MPs who run around all day saying, why does everyone hate us? And I say, well, not that surprising, because they know that you hate them. So why are you surprised by this turn of events? It's not really not very hard to figure out. So I would say our real problem is educated elites in certain institutions in the country that need purging. The problem is not with the normal voters.
So it's replace the elites, not the voters, basically.
Correct.
All right, Dominic Cummings, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.